So today is the final sermon in my series on Sabbath. Next week we're going to shift and start talking about Jubilee for a few weeks. But I want to start here today. In 2007, one of my favorite modern writers, A.J. Jacobs. Anybody else an A.J. Jacobs fan? The know-it-all? Okay. He's kind of a contemporary Bill Bryson. But A.J. Jacobs wrote a book called The Year of Living Biblically, one man's humble quest to follow the Bible as literally as possible. And it's the most ridiculous thing you've ever read. Hilarious, worth revisiting, okay? But in it, he literally tries to follow the Bible as literally as possible, including the Ten Commandments. And so he begins to wrestle, when he gets to the commandment about coveting, he begins to wrestle with his own covetousness and his own desire. And he even begins to take daily notes on what he covets. Jealousy of another speaker's speaking fees. Envy of a man whose faith makes him fearless. George Clooney's level of fame. Even the suspicion that other people's kids are smarter than his kids and nicer than his kids. Jacobs notices as well that many of the Ten Commandments, for example, or in the Ten Commandments, in the one like the 10th commandment on coveting, that some of the references in there don't really apply to modern life in Manhattan. For example, nobody is really walking around Manhattan desiring each other's oxen and cattle. But the final phrase in the 10th commandment, the phrase that says, anything that belongs to your neighbor, you shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor, he concludes, pretty much covers it all without any wiggle room. He even digs in to rabbinical debates about the meaning of covetousness. For example, he talks about two rabbis who debated whether it is okay to covet your neighbor's Jaguar sports car. Or is it wrong only to desire it because it belongs to your neighbor? Or should I not desire any Jaguar sports car? Is the desire itself the problem? Or is the desire only problematic if I'm taking something that belongs to my neighbor? But in all of his honest reflection, and I appreciate it for all of its ridiculousness, there is something that I continued to butt up against that I feel like he was missing, and it was actually indicative of the way we misunderstand not only the commandment about covetousness, but also the commandment about Sabbath and also all of the Ten Commandments. Number one, if covetousness was really only about personal desire, then my neighbor doesn't even need to be mentioned. Why do we even need to talk about neighbors if it's really only about that I should not on the inside desire other things, right? Number two, if the commandment is really only about the neighbor and taking things that belong to my neighbor, but that's already covered in the commandment about don't steal and don't commit adultery, right? Don't take your neighbor's wife. And then finally, the thing that probably I think ties it all together is the fact that, number three, the Ten Commandments aren't really about personal morality at all. They're actually about the collective character of the nation of Israel. They don't receive the Ten Commandments at the bottom of Mount Sinai as private individuals receiving an individual word from God. They receive the Ten Commandments as a collective, as a people, as a tribe, as a nation. So let me maybe boil all this down to a simple way of saying this. The commandment against covetousness is not merely about the individual desire for things. It's about the collective reduction of my neighbor to a thing. The commandment against covetousness is not merely about individual desire for things. It is about the collective reduction of my neighbor to a thing. Dr. King called it thingification. It is the political and economic exploitation of our neighbors so that we can have more no matter the cost to them. It is the political and economic exploitation of my neighbor, of our neighbors, so that we can have more without worrying about the cost to them when we take more. It is the failure to see my neighbor as human because either they possess something I want, say a spouse, a girlfriend, a paycheck, their labor, a car, a home, an identity. Covetousness is not just that we desire what they have, it is that we begin to see them as what they have and to reduce them to what they have. Or we reduce them to obstacles getting in the way of us getting what we want. The commandment then is less a warning to the poor who simply want to survive and desire things that will help them survive. And it is more a call to the wealthy and the powerful who hoard what their neighbors need to survive. It is not, say, for example, a warning against starving children in Gaza who desire food so that they can eat. It is a warning to Israel who is blockading aid so that they can have more power, more land, more resources. Or, if I bring it a little more closer to home, this is just how nerdy I get. I apologize to you in advance. But a few months ago, I was reading 1677 Virginia statutes, and I came across a Virginia slave law. Now, what happened in the background of this slave law is that the enslavers, the masters, were converting their slaves to Christianity. Well, when they became converted, the enslaved folk then said, hey, we're brothers and sisters now, right? And the white enslavers were like, yeah, we are. We're baptized brothers and sisters. So the people who were enslaved said, well, as brothers and sisters, how about some freedom? And the white, good Christian enslavers were like, we're going to have to nip this in the bud. And so the good Christians of Virginia went to the state legislature and they had it codified into law that becoming a Christian and getting baptized did not change an enslaved person's status. No matter what was happening to them spiritually, the white man still had control over their bodies. That is the collective, agreed upon exploitation of other people's bodies and labor to my benefit without any regard for them and their well-being. That is what the commandment, you shall not covet, is talking about. It is not just individual greed. It is systems that reduced humans to commodities or obstacles to us acquiring commodities. It is today why Medicaid is being gutted so billionaires can throw extravagant weddings. It is why corporations lobby politicians to cut education and cancer research so the top 1% can buy yachts. It is why Blackstone real estate investments snatch up homes to inflate property values, leaving working families unable to afford houses without astronomical debt. It is why insurance companies milk you for everything that you have, and then they don't cover your most basic needs. This is not just disagreeable policy, and it is not a right-left issue. It is covetousness codified, written into our system, and propped up by both parties. One just happens to be more blatant about it, and the other is more subtle about it. In contrast, the church is called to be a different kind of people. A people actually who don't only refuse to take from other people, but we are a people who have a completely different set of desires altogether. So what I want you to understand, in conjunction with my sermon last week where I talked about Christianity is not about moralism, that God is not primarily interested in making us moral people. What I want you to understand is that these commandments are not merely about moral conformity. They are not merely about the way you behave so that you fit in and you can stand before St. Peter one day and be like, check out all my good deeds. That's not what this is about. Christianity is actually fundamentally oriented toward changing our internal desires so that our outer actions are not merely morally conformed, but actually an overflow of hearts of love. The church is called to be a people with not just different behaviors, but a different set of desires altogether. Not just a people who refrain from exploiting our neighbors, but a people who don't even want to exploit our neighbors. A people whose heart is sensitive to anybody who is being exploited. No matter whether it's convenient for our political party or not. A people whose are recalibrating their appetites so that our neighbor's well-being becomes our joy and anything that exploits them is distasteful to us. And that takes me back to Sabbath. Because this is what Sabbath practices do for us. Sabbath practices recalibrate us. They teach us that to stop pursuing more so that we can rest in the sufficiency and the gift of God's good world. Sabbath practices tell us that we are not what we produce, and because we are not what we produce, we can recognize that our neighbors should not be reduced to what they produce. That God is providing for us if we could simply recalibrate our taste buds to taste and see that what the Lord offers is good. As Walter Brueggemann says, Sabbath teaches us that we live by gift, not by possession. That we are satisfied by relationship of attentive faithfulness and not by amassing commodities. Especially amassing commodities that are so cheap we don't even know where they came from or who made them or in what conditions they were made. Like someone retraining our taste buds to prefer salad over French fries, Sabbath reshapes what we long for. It reveals how much of our consuming is actually mindless and how much of it forgets the well-being of our neighbors. Without Sabbath, we never realize how enslaved we are to the desire for more, no matter the cost to other people. And we will never be free from the impulse to reduce others to what they produce for us. Sabbath teaches us, trains us, recalibrates us to see those things. So let me end with this story. A few years ago, I was reading a different nerdy book, a really thick book on anthropology called The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity. And in it, sociologist Dave Graeber tells of an 18th century French missionary sent to the Micmac native peoples of Nova Scotia, Canada. Okay? French missionary gone to a Native American people in Nova Scotia. But in his journal, we have record that the French missionary begins to grow bitter toward the Mi'kmaq people. He says that they are impossible, in fact, to convert. Because, literally he says this, because they don't envy us or covet what we have. In fact, he says in his discussions with them, he grows bitter against them because they, in fact, criticize French covetousness. He quotes them saying, "You are envious and are all the time slandering each other. You are thieves and deceivers. You are covetous and are neither generous nor kind. As for us, if we have a morsel of bread, we share it with our neighbor." Instead of possessions and things, Dave Graeber says that the Mi'kmaq had other greater assets: ease, comfort, and time. If we have a morsel of bread, we will often ask, "Is that hungry person deserve bread? Did they work sufficiently for this bread? Are they worthy of the bread?" And I think the Mi'kmaq understood the gospel better than we do and better than French missionaries do. Good news to a hungry person is bread. But in our covetousness, we have been shaped by capitalism to believe that everybody should be reduced to their labor, what they can produce, or what they can do for me before I do anything for them. We do not often realize how our collective, chronic restlessness and anxiety about money and things, how we have this lack of ease and comfort and connection and time, and how all of it is built up by this system of American covetousness. And we rarely recognize how that system actually threatens our relationships, especially with our most vulnerable neighbors. Ever since I was thinking about this the other day, this is free. I was thinking about this the other day. Ever since I was a little kid, I remember I had this little black and white television in my bedroom. My mom would send me to bed at like 8:30, and I'd turn on that television, and I'd watch whatever sitcom was on, and then I would watch the 10 o'clock news, and I'd go to sleep, right? And every night on the 10 o'clock news, they would tell me how the Dow Jones was doing. And I didn't even know who Dow Jones was. But I knew that when that number was going up, it was good for us, and when it was going down, it was bad for us, right? And as I became an adult, I realized how often that number goes up. And it does nothing for normal people. How often that number goes up, and yet the number of unhoused people and hungry children in our society continues to increase. How often that number goes up, and CEO profits go up, but minimum wage has stayed stagnant. Every night, the 10 o'clock news was feeding in me the covetous desire for somebody in my society to have more. But as a child who grew up on welfare and free lunches and government cheese, they taught even me that the system of covetousness and the wealth of the people at the top matters more than how the vulnerable people at the bottom are doing. And I wonder what it will look like for us as a community to evaluate economic success, not based on how the 1% are doing, but how the most vulnerable people in our society are doing. That would be what would make America great. Sabbath reminds us by slowing us down, interrupting our addiction to acquisition, teaching us that we are not what we buy, that our neighbors are not what they own, and our neighbors are not to be reduced to what they can produce. And in the stillness of Sabbath, we might just remember that these ancient commands, whether they're about oxen or donkeys, are more relevant than we ever imagined. Not just in ancient agrarian Israel, but in post-agrarian Manhattan, and maybe even modern-day Memphis too.